The message came through official channels first, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. I was Senior Astropathic Liaison Verant Kos, assigned to the Telepathica archives beneath the Imperial Palace. For 37 years, I served as a bridge between the choir chambers and the administrative apparatus that processed their visions. Their screams, their fragmentary glimpses of the warp, translated into actionable intelligence. I was neither psyker nor warrior, neither priest nor lord. I was a functionary, a processor of impossible things. I filed the dreams of the dying and cross-referenced the prophecies of the mad, and I did so with the quiet efficiency that the Imperium rewards with continued breathing. The morning it began, I was reviewing a backlog of secondary emanations from the segmentum solar relay stations. Routine work, the kind of tedium that had long since ceased to bother me, that had become instead a comfort, the familiar weight of data slates, the scratch of my stylus, the distant murmur of the choir chambers 3 levels below, where psychers burned out their minds, transmitting messages across the stars. The archives smelled of old paper and recycled air, and the faint ozone tang that always clung to anything touched by psychic resonance. The first anomaly appeared at 7:42 Terran Standard. A burst transmission from the Astronomicon monitoring station, flagged urgent. I almost dismissed it. Everything was flagged urgent in those days. The galaxy bleeding from 1,000 wounds, the great rift splitting reality like a surgeon's cut. But something in the encoding made me pause. The cipher was old, pre-heresy old. The kind of encryption I had only ever seen in archived training materials, relics from an age when the Imperium was young and its creators still walked among humanity. The message was simple. Primarch return confirmed. Inbound Terra. All of them. I remember laughing. The sound echoed strangely in my small office, bouncing off the metal walls and the stacks of documentation that form my daily landscape. All of them. The phrase was absurd. Most of the Primarchs were dead, lost, or damned. The lion slept beneath the rock, they said. Vulcan had vanished into legend. Corax had dissolved into shadow. Guilliman alone had returned, and his resurrection had nearly broken the Imperium trying to process it. All of them was a joke, a glitch, a corrupted transmission. Then the second message arrived. Then the third. By noon, the archives were receiving confirmed sightings from 17 different relay stations across the solar system. By evening, the custodians had sealed the Telepathica district. I should have fled then. I should have found some way to disappear into the endless warrens of the palace, to become one of the countless millions who labored in anonymity beneath the shadow of the Golden Throne. But I was curious. 37 years of processing impossible things, and I had never seen anything truly impossible. I had seen horrors translated into sterile reports. I had filed evidence of demonic incursions and Xenos atrocities, and the slow collapse of human civilization on 1,000 worlds. But I had never seen a miracle. The first Primarch arrived 3 days later. I wasn't present, of course. No one of my station would be permitted near the landing zones, near the processional routes, near any of the sacred spaces where demigods walked. But the archives received the documentation. The endless, meticulous documentation that was my life's work. I processed the initial reports with trembling hands, reading descriptions of beings so vast that normal language seemed to fail. The lion, they said, had emerged from the warp itself, his ship trailing impossible geometries that made observers weep blood. Vulcan had appeared on Mars, rising from the depths of a forge complex that had been sealed since the Great Crusade. Lehman Russ walked out of a blizzard that spontaneously materialized in the Himalayan exclusion zone, his wolves howling songs that drove listeners to madness or ecstasy. The reports multiplied, contradicted, fractured. Corvus Corax materialized in the shadows of the palace itself, and 300 servants died of terror before anyone could confirm his presence. Jagatai Khan burst from the webway gate beneath the throne room, his bike's engines screaming a frequency that shattered every piece of glass within a kilometer radius. Rogel Dawn, who had been dead for 10,000 years, walked through the Eternity Gate as if he had merely stepped out for a moment and was returning home. The Loyalists, the heroes, the returned sons of the Emperor. But they were not alone. The archives began receiving reports of other arrivals, sightings that the custodians tried to suppress, transmissions that were scrubbed from official channels within hours of their receipt. But I had learned long ago that nothing is ever truly erased in the Imperium, merely buried, relocated, filed in obscure locations where only those who know where to look can find it. I found the reports. I read them with growing horror. Perturabo materialized in orbit, his flagship emerging from the warp, surrounded by daemon engines that screamed in voices of tortured iron. Fulgrim descended upon the palace walls themselves, and those who looked upon his serpentine beauty were found later with their eyes carved out by their own hands, smiles of terrible contentment frozen on their dead faces. Angron carved a bloody path through the defensive lines before anyone could confirm whether he had come to destroy or to something else. His intentions were unclear, his rage was not. And there were others. Lorga, preaching from the steps of the ecclesiastical palace, his words rewriting the faith of millions who heard them. Mortarion, trailing plague and despair, his presence alone enough to condemn 3 hive spires to quarantine and eventual exterminatus-level cleansing. Magnus, manifesting in 17 places simultaneously, each avatar speaking different truths that contradicted each other perfectly. The traitors, the damned, the lost sons who had broken the Imperium 10,000 years ago, all of them, returning at once, as if summoned by some cosmic signal that humanity could not perceive. I processed the reports. I filed them. I cross-referenced them with historical records, with prophecies, with the fragmentary visions that our astropaths had been screaming for months. I did my duty, because duty was all I had ever known, and because to stop working would have meant confronting the truth that my work could not contain. The Primarchs were not meeting in council. They were not forging alliances or renewing ancient grudges. They were converging. All of them, loyalist and traitor alike, were moving toward a single point. The Sanctum Imperialis. The throne room. The place where the Emperor had sat dying for 10,000 years, holding back the tide of chaos with the shattered remnants of his immortal will. The documentation from this period becomes fragmented, unreliable. I can only piece together what happened from partial records, from the testimony of survivors, few as they were, and from my own limited observations. The custodians tried to stop them. These golden giants, the Emperor's own bodyguards, who had held the line against every threat that had ever approached the throne. They died, not in battle that might have been comprehensible. They simply stopped. One report described a custodian freezing mid-stride as the lion passed, his armor locked in place, his hearts ceasing to beat. Another described custodians kneeling before Guilliman, their weapons lowering of their own accord, their voices speaking words in a language that no human throat should be capable of producing. The Sisters of Silence fell next. These nulls, these pariahs, whose very presence caused psychic powers to wither and die. Their gift meant nothing before beings who were more than psychers, more than warriors, more than anything that null genes had been designed to suppress. I have a report unconfirmed, impossible to verify, that describes a Sister of Silence screaming, actually screaming, with a voice she had never possessed, as Lorgar walked past her. The sound, witnesses said, was the most beautiful thing they had ever heard. The ordinary soldiers did not even try to resist. The Imperial fists who guarded the palace, the Ultramarines who had accompanied Guilliman on his crusade, the Dark Angels and Space Wolves, and all the other chapters who had rushed to Terra when word spread of what was happening. They stood aside. They knelt. They wept. I watched some of this from my office, through the flickering feeds that still connected to external surveillance. The archives were deep beneath the palace, insulated from the chaos above, but not entirely cut off. I saw Primarchs walking through corridors that had been built by their fathers' hands. I saw brothers who had tried to kill each other 10,000 years ago walking side by side, not speaking, not fighting, simply moving. Drawn towards something, the lion walked next to Perturabo, and neither seemed to notice the other's presence. Vulcan's form blazed with perpetual fire, and Mortarian's presence should have extinguished it, but the flames burned on, illuminating the Plague Lord's rotted features in hellish detail. Sanguinius was there. Sanguinius, who had died at Horus's hand, whose absence had defined the blood angels for 10 millennia of grief. He walked among his brothers as if he had never left, his wings trailing golden light, his face serene. The reports of his presence broke something in my mind. I had processed documentation of dead Primarchs before fragmentary evidence, disputed sightings, the desperate hopes of mourning chapters. But this was confirmed, verified, witnessed by thousands. The dead were returning with the living. I left my office then. I do not know what drove me: curiosity, terror, the simple need to see with my own eyes what my documentation could never adequately describe. The corridors of the archive level were empty. Everyone else had fled or hidden or died. I walked alone through the labyrinthine passages that I had traveled for 37 years, and for the first time in my life, I found them unfamiliar. The walls seemed to shift. The lighting flickered in patterns that suggested meaning. The air itself tasted different, charged, alive, pregnant with significance. I found a maintenance shaft that led upward. I climbed. The sounds reached me first. Not battle sounds I had expected, battle sounds, the clash of weapons, the roar of bolters. Instead, I heard singing, a choir of 20 voices, each one distinct, each one impossibly resonant, harmonizing in a key that made my heart stutter and my eyes water. The Primarchs were singing, a song in no language I recognized, in no language that had ever been recorded in human history. Later, scholars would speculate that it was the tongue of the first men, the proto-language of old Earth, the words that humanity had spoken before it ever dreamed of reaching the stars. I do not know. I only know that the song burrowed into my skull and made a home there, and that I hear it still, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the spaces between my heartbeats. I emerged into a corridor I did not recognize. The architecture was wrong, too old, too grand, carved from materials that glittered with internal light. I was somewhere deep within the inner palace, in passages that should have been sealed to anyone below the rank of High Lord, but the seals had broken. The wards had failed. The barriers that had protected the Sanctum Imperialis for 10,000 years had simply ceased to exist. I followed the singing. The corridor opened into a vast chamber. Not the throne room itself. I would learn later that I had emerged into one of the antechambers, a space used for preparation rituals by the custodians who tended the Emperor's physical form. But even this space was larger than any structure I had ever entered, its ceiling lost in golden darkness, its walls carved with scenes from an age when humanity had stood upon the threshold of godhood. The Primarchs stood in a circle, all of them, 20 figures, each one unique, each one terrible in their own way. The Loyalists in their Baroque armor, their heraldry blazing with colors that seemed to burn directly into the retina, the traitors in their corrupted plate, their mutations and gifts displayed without shame or concealment, living and dead alike, standing together as they had not stood since the days of the Great Crusade. They were not fighting. They were waiting. I hid behind a pillar, a laughable precaution, as if mere stone could conceal me from beings who had conquered worlds and broken armies. But they did not notice me. Their attention was fixed on something else, on someone else. The door to the throne room opened. I cannot describe what emerged. I have tried. I have written this account 17 times, and each time I reach this moment, my words fail me. Language was not designed to contain what I saw. Human perception was not evolved to process it. The Emperor walked, not the corpse on the golden throne that remained where it had always been. I learned later, still connected to the machines that sustained it, still burning with the psychic light that kept the Astronomicon aflame. But something else came through that door. A projection, perhaps. a manifestation, an aspect of divinity given form that mortal eyes could witness without immediate death. He was smaller than his sons. This struck me as wrong, profoundly wrong, until I realized that size was meaningless, that he was both infinitely larger and incomprehensibly smaller than any of them, that his dimensions existed in states that my mind could only resolve by choosing one interpretation and clinging to it desperately. He spoke. One word that I have never been able to remember, that slips away from my memory the moment I try to grasp it. One word that contained, somehow, everything that needed to be said. The Primarchs knelt, all of them, loyalist and traitor, living and dead. Guilliman knelt beside Magnus. The Lion knelt beside Perturabo. Sanguinius knelt beside Fulgrim. Angron knelt, his rage stilled for the first time in 10,000 years. Lorgar knelt, his faith, whatever twisted form it had taken, bent toward its original object. They knelt, and they were silent, and the song that had drawn me to this place resolved into a single perfect note that hung in the air like a promise. What happened next is where my documentation fails entirely. I have fragmentary memories, images that may be real, or may be the hallucinations of a mind pushed beyond its limits. I remember light, not golden, not any color I can name, but light that seemed to carry weight, to have texture, to communicate meaning directly into my soul. I remember voices speaking in unison, 20 voices that had once torn the galaxy apart, now harmonizing perfectly. I remember pain, not physical pain, but the pain of understanding, of having truths pressed into a consciousness too small to contain them. I remember the Emperor speaking again, not words this time, but information, history, purpose, plan. This is what I understood, or what I have convinced myself I understood. The Emperor had never intended for the Imperium to become what it was. The calcified theocracy, the endless war, the grinding oppression that crushed humanity in the name of protecting it. This was not his design. This was the result of his absence, of his 10,000-year silence, of the gap between his vision and the flawed humans who had tried to implement it. The Primarchs were not meant to be generals, not meant to be conquerors, not meant to be the weapons they had become. They were something else, something larger, something that the war with Horus had prevented them from ever becoming. They were meant to be aspects of humanity itself. The Lion was strategy, not just war. Perturabo was creation, not just destruction. Sanguinius was sacrifice, not just martyrdom. Even the traitors, even the ones who had fallen to chaos, were meant to represent something necessary, something that humanity needed but could not safely contain within mortal minds. And they were meant to return, all of them, together, at the moment when humanity's need was greatest. That moment had come. The great rift had split the galaxy. Chaos was ascendant. The Tyranids consumed world after world. The Necrons stirred from their tombs. Orcs rampaged unchecked. The Tau expanded into the void left by the Imperium's collapse. And humanity itself was fracturing, its faith becoming its prison, its survival mechanisms becoming its executioners. The Emperor could not heal, could not rise, could not leave the throne that sustained both him and the Imperium. But he could call his sons home. He could reunite what had been broken. He could, through them, begin the work that should have been done 10,000 years ago. I do not know how long I remained in that chamber. Time had ceased to function normally. When I finally emerged crawling, weeping, my mind scorched by revelation, days had passed, perhaps weeks. The palace had changed around me, rearranged by forces that operated on a scale I could not comprehend. The Primarchs had dispersed. Each one had taken on a task, had begun a work that would reshape the Imperium from its foundations. Guilliman remained to govern, but he was no longer alone in his burden. The Lion had reclaimed his legion and ventured into the dark spaces between stars. Vulcan had returned to Mars, and the Mechanicus was screaming prayers of joy and terror in equal measure. Corax hunted in the shadows. But now his prey was not merely the enemies of man, it was the corruption that had taken root in humanity itself. The traitors, the damned ones, they had not been forgiven. That is important to understand. Forgiveness was not what the Emperor offered. Redemption was not available to those who had made the choices they had made. But purpose was. Lorgar preached again, and his words this time did not corrupt, they clarified. The faith of the Imperium, the twisted dogma that had grown like a cancer around the Emperor's true intentions, began to dissolve under the weight of truth. Billions died in the transition. Entire worlds committed mass suicide when they learned that everything they believed had been a lie. But billions more survived, their faith not destroyed but refined, tempered, made into something that could withstand the darkness. Mortarion walked the plague zones, and where he passed, the diseases he had once spread began to change. Not to vanish, Nurgle's gifts could not be simply revoked, but to transform. Illness became immunity, decay became renewal. The cycle of death and rebirth that the plague god represented was turned, for the first time, toward a purpose that did not serve chaos. Angron raged, as he always had, as he always would, but his rage was directed now, focused. The butcher's nails still sang in his skull, still drove him toward violence without end, but the violence found targets that deserved it. Slavers, tyrants, those who preyed upon the weak. For the first time since his fall, Angron became what he had been meant to be, not a beast, but a liberator. I processed the documentation of these changes. It was, after all, my purpose. The archives became a nexus of information as the Imperium began its transformation. Reports flowed in from every corner of the galaxy. Wars ending, wars beginning. Systems falling silent as they were consumed by the aftershocks of change. Systems screaming as they were reborn. I worked, I filed, I cross-referenced. I performed my function as I had always performed it, because the alternative was to confront what I had witnessed, and I was not ready for that confrontation. Months passed, perhaps years. The calendar itself had become unreliable, rewritten 17 times as the administratum struggled to process the new reality, and then the summons came. A custodian stood in my doorway. Not a message, not a data slate, not the impersonal machinery of bureaucracy. A custodian, in person, his golden armor blazing with reflected light, his spear humming with contained power. "You are Verant Kos," he said. Not a question. I am. You were present. In the antechamber. On the day of the reunion. I considered lying. The thought lasted exactly as long as it took for me to meet the custodian's eyes. There was no point. There had never been any point. I was. You are summoned. I followed him through corridors that I did not recognize, through checkpoints that had not existed before, through spaces that seemed to fold and unfold around us as we walked. The palace had changed, was still changing, growing, perhaps, healing from wounds that had been inflicted 10,000 years ago. We entered a chamber of moderate size, barely larger than my office, which seemed absurd given the being who waited within. Guilliman sat at a desk, reading. The Primarch of the Ultramarines, Lord Commander of the Imperium, the Avenging Sun. He was reading. A data slate, much like the ones I processed daily. His brow was furrowed in concentration. He looked, impossibly, tired. "Verant Kos," he said, without looking up. "Senior Astropathic Liaison. 37 years of service. 0 disciplinary actions. 0 commendations. The perfect functionary. My lord, you witnessed something you should not have survived. By all rights, your mind should have been destroyed by what you saw. Instead, you returned to work. You continued processing documentation. You filed reports about the end of the Imperium as we knew it, with the same diligence you applied to supply requisitions." He looked up then, and his eyes, ancient, weary, blazing with an intelligence that made me feel like an insect, met mine. Why? I had no answer that seemed adequate. I had no answer at all. I simply stood and waited, and eventually the truth came out in words that felt inadequate to the moment, because someone has to. Guilliman stared at me for a long moment, then he smiled, a small smile barely visible, gone almost before I could register its presence. "Yes," he said. "Someone does." He rose. The motion was fluid, powerful, a reminder that the being before me had shattered armies and conquered worlds. He walked around the desk, and I found myself stepping backward involuntarily, my survival instinct screaming at me to flee from this apex predator. He stopped, waited, allowed me to master myself. "The Imperium is changing," he said. "Everything we were is being remade. The systems that sustained us for 10,000 years are being torn down and rebuilt. It will take centuries, millennia, and it will require people who can process the impossible without breaking, who can witness miracles and return to work the next day, who can serve without seeking glory or recognition. My lord, I am merely a functionary." "Yes." His smile returned, wider this time, almost warm. "You are. And that is exactly what we need." He reached into his armor and withdrew a seal. Golden, ancient, bearing a symbol I had only ever seen in the oldest archives, the most restricted documentation. "The Council of Nicaea forbade the use of psychic power by the legions," he said. "My father overturned that decree, in the end. But the council itself was never dissolved. The institution remains, dormant, waiting." He pressed the seal into my hands. The metal was warm not from his touch, but from within, pulsing with a power I could not name. "I am reconvening it, not to judge psychers, to judge truth, to evaluate claims, to process documentation, to separate fact from fiction in an age when reality itself has become unreliable. I need archivists, bureaucrats, functionaries who can witness the impossible and file it appropriately." I looked at the seal, at him, at the impossible future he was offering. "I am not qualified," I said. "I am not worthy. I am merely someone who survived looking upon the face of divinity and went back to work," he interrupted. "Merely someone who processed the end of the world with proper citation formatting. Merely the most qualified person I have found in 6 months of searching." He turned away, returning to his desk, to his data slate, to the endless work that awaited him. "The Imperium needs heroes," he said, not looking at me. "It has always needed heroes. But it also needs those who can count the heroes, record their deeds, file their requisitions, and process their deaths. Without the functionaries, the heroes accomplish nothing. Without the archivists, their sacrifices are forgotten." "You are not unimportant, Varant Kos. You are essential." I left that chamber with the seal clutched in my trembling hands. I walked through the changing palace, through corridors that whispered with possibility, through spaces where the future was being built on the bones of the past. I returned to the archives. I sat at my desk. I began to process the documentation of a new age. The Primarchs walk among us now, all of them, working together for the first time since the species was young. The enemies of humanity have not vanished. The galaxy remains a howling darkness filled with horrors beyond counting. But something has changed, something fundamental. The Imperium is no longer merely surviving. It is, tentatively, impossibly, beginning to live. I witness this transformation daily. I file reports of worlds saved and worlds lost. I process documentation of miracles and atrocities. I archive the words of demigods and the deaths of mortals. I do my duty, as I have always done, because duty is what I am. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I hear the song, that perfect harmony of 20 voices, the sound that the Primarchs made when they stood together in the presence of their father. It echoes in my memory, fading but never quite gone, a reminder of what I witnessed, what I survived, what I have been given the privilege of recording. The Emperor walks, not in body that remains on the throne, broken, burning, sustaining the Astronomicon that guides humanity through the darkness, but in spirit, in purpose, in the work of his sons, reunited at last, and I am here to document it. I am Varant Kos, senior archivist of the reconvened Council of Nicaea, witness to the impossible, Functionary of the changing Imperium, this is my confession. This is my record. This is my duty. Someone has to file it all. It might as well be me.